Setting up remote access to internal workstations and servers in order to allow for remote development and remote debugging can often be a challenge. Security is always a concern, but there may also be multiple hops involved in order to start from the computer you are sitting at and finally reaching the system you are developing on. TotalView's Remote Display Client, or RDC, was built exactly for these remote access scenarios. The Remote Display Client is a free tool shipped with TotalView that allows developers to easily establish a remote development session by automatically setting up a remote display environment from a remote system across multiple connecting computers and to the user's laptop. The Remote Display Client does this through the following three components. The Remote Display Client, a display window, runs on the computer you are sitting at. The supported platforms include Linux, both 32 and 64-bit, Windows and Mac OS. The Remote Display Client server is an invisible component responsible for managing the movement of information between the viewer, the remote host and the client. The server can run on all systems that TotalView supports. For example, you can run the client on a Windows system and set up a viewer environment on a Linux 64-bit machine. And lastly, the Remote Display Client viewer is a remote desktop window that appears on the client system. All interactions between this window and the system running TotalView are handled by the server. There are several requirements needed before running the Remote Display Client. Obviously, first of all, you need to have TotalView installed on the remote server. You also need to have X Windows and Xterm installed on the server. If you're running a Linux client, you will need to have Xterm, and if you're running a Mac OS client, you'll need to have Xquartz installed. So let's see how this works in practice. So I'm going to run the Remote Display Client on a Linux machine. So first of all, I run the Remote Display Client shell script, which brings up the Remote Display Client user interface. We can see here over on the left, we have session profiles. So once you've entered the details for a remote host, you can save a session and you can load it up for future use. You also have your username stored. Remote Display Client doesn't store passwords, it prompts you to enter the password when you make a connection. As we mentioned, you can also enter host details if you have to enter several machines in order to get to the remote computer. Next, you have the path to TotalView on the remote host. You have any optional arguments for TotalView, and you can specify an executable path and name and arguments for that executable. You can also use a batch system such as Load Leveler and PBS Pro, but we're not going to use that in this case. Under the Advanced Options tab, we can enter commands before TotalView begins. We can also specify a font path and a color location. You can also specify a display number, an SSH port number, and a window manager. These are all optional advanced options. I'm going to go ahead and launch the debug session now, and Remote Display Client prompts me for a password. Now we can see that TotalView is starting up, and you may notice that this is the classic TotalView user interface. I'm going to go ahead and start a session that I was running previously and hit go. And we can start debugging our program. Now the reason it starts up the classic user interface is that the Remote Display Client is currently configured to use the classic TotalView user interface. If we want to use the new user interface, there's a very simple workaround that we can use. Let me show you how to do that. So first of all, I'm just going to exit out of TotalView. I'm going to go back to the Remote Display Client. In the debugging session, and if I specify an argument to TotalView, the -v flag, What this will do, it will print out the version of TotalView and then exit, leaving us with an SSH window from which we can launch the new TotalView user interface. So if I go ahead and launch the debug session, then it prompts me for my password. Then it's going to print the version of TotalView and exit. And from here, I can simply launch a TotalView session, which will bring up the new TotalView user interface. So here I can launch exactly the same session on a program called Combined. I click on that, and that brings up the debugging window. And then I can start debugging as before, and we can see that this is the new user interface with the syntax color highlighting. So let's go ahead and start the debugging session as we would normally.